going live. Is it live yet? I feel like it's always actually live for a solid 2 seconds before it says, now you're live. So I feel weird compulsion to do a little dance. Hello. Hello, everybody. Hello, probably Esty and Michelle. How do you like my new glasses? I just got them. They're the same frames I had before in a different color.
One can never have too many pairs of glasses.
Well, I just love those frames so much. And when I saw that Zenny had added them in more colors, I was like, better get a pair now. So if I break my glasses or something happens to them, I will have...
That is smart.
I won't go on the website and then have to wait for them to ship it. And also they might be like, oh, we discontinued those frames. And then I would cry.
Been
because I love these frames.
A very old backup pair more than once.
Yep.
Not great.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad you like them. Mm-hmm. Okay. Chapter 47. Still have to do the counting. Stupid Roman numerals. Chapter 47 is where we will be reading today. Where we left off, we had just found out the bombshell had been dropped on Highbury that Mr. Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax have in fact been engaged for months in secret. Pepper, don't leave that alone. We got a box from a pet supply website, which will remain nameless because they didn't pay me. And Pepper we opened it, but Pepper is just like, I'll be taking this matter into my own hands. And he's trying to get his treats
or my
out.
own teeth, as the case may be.
Yes.
Okay.
That was fun to watch for a second, but why don't we hide it? Because I feel like he would chew through it if given the opportunity.
Given enough time, he definitely
he's not going to be on camera now because he's going to follow Carolyn to where she's taking the treats. All right, so
sealed in a golden box of
magic. He can't get in there.
Not for want of trying.
So yeah, this is honestly, I'm really excited to see where we're, how things are going to proceed from here, because I more or less know from having seen adaptations, what happens in between this bombshell and the end of the book, but I have no idea how they're going to be paced out because there's significantly more book still than you would expect for how much is usually depicted in adaptation. So I'm really excited to see like how quickly do we get to the two. There's at least two other revelations I can think of that have yet to come, and I just don't know how quickly they're going to come on us. So I'm excited. All right, chapter 47. Harriet, poor Harriet. Those were the words. In them lay the tormenting ideas which Emma could not get rid of, and which constituted the real misery of the business to her. Frank Churchill had behaved very ill by herself, very ill in many ways, but it was not so much his behavior as her own which made her so angry with him. It was the scrape which he had drawn her into on Harriet's account. Yes, it's all his fault that you decided that he and Harriet were totes in love. It was the scrape which he had drawn her on Harriet's account that gave the deepest hue to his offense. Poor Harriet, to be a second time the dupe of her misconceptions and fancy. Mr. Knightley had spoken prophetically when he once said, Emma, you have been no friend to Harriet Smith. She was afraid she had done her nothing but disservice, which is true. It was true that she had not to charge herself in this instance, as in the former, with being the sole and original author of the mischief, with having suggested such feelings as might otherwise never have entered Harriet's imagination, for Harriet had acknowledged her admiration and preference of Frank Churchill before she had ever given her a hint on the subject. But she felt completely guilty of having encouraged what she might have repressed. Oh, I just can't wait.
Also, she thinks everything is up to her.
Yeah. She might have prevented the indulgence and increase of such sentiments. Her influence would have been enough. And now she was very conscious that she ought to have prevented them. She felt that she had been risking her friend's happiness on most insufficient grounds. Common sense would have directed her to tell Harriet that she must not allow herself to think of him, and that there were 500 chances to 1 against his ever caring for her. Hi, Pepper. There are no treats over here. Just
like,
a
are you
book.
sure?
Just a book.
What if I sniff your face?
But with common sense, she added, I am afraid I have had little to do. At least she now acknowledges that. She was extremely angry with herself. If she could not have been angry with Frank Churchill too, it would have been dreadful. As for Jane Fairfax, she might at least relieve her feelings from any present solicitude on her account. Harriet would be anxiety enough. She need no longer be unhappy about Jane, whose troubles and whose ill health, having, of course, the same origin, must be equally under cure. I mean, that is an assumption, but it's probably right.
Yeah.
That her illness was only a result of her quarreling and the miscommunication with Frank. It's probably true, but it's also kind of presumptuous.
It is an assumption. I mean, Jane has been coughing. I don't know if that was an affect or if
I assume she was a little bit ill, and she just emphasized that for the desire of going back to Highbury instead of going to Ireland, and then staying in Highbury and putting off taking it. But I assume she wasn't completely faking the illness, but maybe she was. I don't remember if Jane Austen ever explicitly says so. Yeah. Anyway,
but again, like we were talking last time with women, it's
right.
So.
Yeah, they had no other choice. Yeah. If they were in emotional distress, they just had to claim illness. Must be equally under cure. Her days of insignificance and evil were over. She would soon be well and happy and prosperous. Emma could now imagine why her own attentions had been slighted. This discovery laid many smaller matters open. No doubt it had been from jealousy. In Jane's eyes, she had been a rival, and well might anything she could offer of assistance or regard be repulsed. An airing in the Hartfield carriage would have been the rack, and arrowroot from the Hartfield storeroom must have been poison. She understood it all, and as far as her mind could disengage itself from the injustice and selfishness of angry feelings, she acknowledged that Jane Fairfax would have neither elevation nor happiness beyond her desert. Her desert.
One S or two?
One S, but...
That is weird.
Yeah. It's just a figure of speech or not.
I
thought it meant like her dessert, as in like just desserts.
Yeah.
But isn't that usually spelled with 2 S's? Like something you eat that is delicious?
Or
anyway.
The thing that comes after.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's...
But poor Harriet was such an engrossing charge. There was little sympathy to be spared for anybody else. Emma was sadly fearful that this second disappointment would be more severe than the first. Considering the very superior claims of the object, it ought, and judging by its apparently stronger effect on Harriet's mind, it would produce reserve and self-command. She must communicate the painful truth, however, and as soon as possible. An injunction of secrecy had been among Mr. Weston's parting words. For the present, the whole affair was to be completely a secret. Mr. Churchill had made a point of it, as a token of respect to the wife he had lost so very recently. And everybody admitted it to be no more than due decorum. Emma had promised, but still Harriet must be accepted. It was her superior duty. In spite of her vexation, she could not help feeling it almost ridiculous that she should have the very same distressing and delicate office to perform by Harriet, which Mrs. Weston had just gone through by herself. The intelligence, which had been so anxiously announced to her, she was now to be anxiously announcing to another. Her heart beat quick on hearing Harriet's footstep and voice. So, she supposed, had poor Mrs. Weston felt when she was approaching Randall's. Honestly, her putting herself in somebody else's head, I feel like is good for Emma. Occasionally imagining how other people feel.
Yeah. Much like her father.
Yes.
in his very limited capacity.
Yes. Could the event of the disclosure bear an equal resemblance? But of that, unfortunately, there could be no chance. Well, Miss Woodhouse, cried Harriet, coming eagerly into the room. Oh, hello, Aaron. That is right. You've barely missed anything from today, although I don't think you were here yesterday, so you missed quite a lot. Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Jane Fairfax have in fact been engaged in secret for months. And Mr. and Mrs. Weston thought Emma would be upset about it because they thought she was in love with him. But she's like, no, I like whatever. He's fine. Good for him. But Emma now has to tell Harriet, whom she believes is in love with Frank Churchill. So we shall see how that goes.
We shall see.
Well, Miss Woodhouse, cried Harriet, coming eagerly into the room, is not this the oddest news that ever was? What news do you mean? Replied Emma, unable to guess by look or voice whether Harriet could indeed have received any hint. About Jane Fairfax. Did you ever hear anything so strange? Oh, you need not be afraid of owning it to me, for Mr. Weston has told me himself. I'm sorry, I didn't remember that part or didn't know it. It's hilarious. Mr. Weston, you must tell nobody. Emma, this is top secret. Oh, Harriet, have you heard the news?
Also, Mr. Weston.
I met him just now. He told me it was to be a great secret, and therefore I should not think of mentioning it to anybody but you. But he said you knew it. But who else will Mr. Weston tell? Anyway. What did Mr. Weston tell you? Said Emma, still perplexed. Oh, he told me all about it, that Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill are to be married, and that they have been privately engaged to one another this long time. How very odd. It was indeed so odd. Harriet's behavior was so extremely odd that Emma did not know how to understand it. Her character appeared absolutely changed. She seemed to propose showing no agitation or disappointment or peculiar concern in the discovery. Emma looked at her, quite unable to speak. Had you any idea, cried Harriet, of his being in love with her? You perhaps might. You, blushing as she spoke, who can see into everybody's heart, but nobody else. She still thinks Emma has this ability, despite what happened with Mr. Elton.
Yeah.
That was just a fluke.
Yeah.
Upon my word, said Emma, I begin to doubt my having any such talent. Can you seriously ask me, Harriet, whether I imagined him attached to another woman at the very time that I was, tacitly, if not openly, encouraging you to give way to your own feelings? I never had the slightest suspicion, till within the last hour, of Mr. Frank Churchill's having the least regard for Jane Fairfax. You may be very sure that if I had, I should have cautioned you accordingly. Me, cried Harriet, coloring and astonished. Why should you caution me? You do not think I care about Mr. Frank Churchill? I am delighted to hear you speak so stoutly on the subject, replied Emma, smiling. But you do not mean to deny that there was a time, and not very distant either, when you gave me reason to understand that you did care for him? Him? Oh, never, never. Dear Miss Woodhouse, how could you so mistake me? Turning away, distressed.
I don't know, the words that you used.
No, it's perfectly understandable. This miscommunication, I feel like, is actually pretty reasonable.
Yeah, it's unreasonable in this case for Harriet to assume.
But
to assume Emma knew what she meant when she never.
So this whole turning away, distressed in parentheses, like it's a stage direction. They do so much in this book.
Yeah,
and I don't like the you blushing as she spoke might have been put comma quote blushing as she spoke comma open quote in a modern book. And they use parentheses for it, and it's just I don't feel like she did that in Pride and Prejudice. So I don't wonder. I don't know was it a new thing? Did she? I don't know. Anyway,
she's like, let me try this new thing.
How could you so mistake me, Harriet? Cried Emma after a moment's pause. What do you mean? Good heavens! What do you mean? Mistake you? Am I to suppose then? She could not speak another word. Her voice was lost, and she sat down, waiting in great terror till Harriet should answer. Oh dear. Harriet, who was standing at some distance and with face turned from her, did not immediately say anything, and when she did speak, it was in a voice nearly as agitated as Emma's. I should not have thought it possible, she began, that you could have misunderstood me. I know we agreed never to name him, but considering how infinitely superior he is to everybody else, I should not have thought it possible that I could be supposed to mean any other person. Mr. Frank Churchill. Indeed, I do not know who would ever look at him in the company of the other. I hope I have a better taste than to think of Mr. Frank Churchill, who was like nobody by his side. Diss on Emma, who did have a crush on him for a while.
Seriously.
She must have never mentioned her attraction to Frank Churchill to Harriet. Yeah. Otherwise, Harriet wouldn't be so open about being like, Frank Churchill.
No, I don't think she did. Although they were like kind of openly flirting. So like.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe again, Harriet is just so confused in this moment that she's not watching her speech. Yeah, Esty said it was a bit absurd that they agreed not to say his name. It does feel a little bit Deus Ex Machina, like just, and we won't say his name for reasons so that we can go on being miscommunicating.
Right, yeah.
But her given reason for that is that they're like, well, it's not likely to ever happen. It's pretty unlikely because of their difference in situation and age.
Right.
Harriet is 17. I'm surprised that didn't come up. But I guess Harriet might have thought Emma meant that as well as their position in society when she said, possibly, something like the difference in your positions or situations in life is so great. Yeah. She might have thought, oh, yes, the age thing as well.
Yeah.
Because that definitely was not common. A 17-year-old girl and a 37-year-old man.
Yeah.
That I know that much.
Yeah.
Esty says it feels Oscar Wilde-esque a little bit. Just like,
Oscar
and then this will happen because don't worry about whether people actually do this thing, but like trust me, it's gonna result in so many good shenanigans. You're gonna love it. Anyway, I think that the let us not even say his name so we don't encourage ourselves to speak of him and encourage your attraction to or attachment to him or whatever. Yeah. It's like, okay, she tried at least to come up with a reason why they wouldn't say his name, but it does feel a little bit convenient. Well, especially when you know it's coming. Maybe if you didn't know it was coming, it wouldn't seem that odd. Esty, I'm assuming you've seen an adaptation of Emma. Anyway.
That is,
if anybody is watching this and listening to all the chapters, so not Aaron, who has never read Emma or heard or seen an adaptation or anything, and you were actually surprised by this revelation and didn't think it was weird. As he says, nope, it's just forced. All right, well, you say so. Upon your word.
I don't know.
I hope I have better taste and think of Mr. Frank Churchill, who is like nobody by his side, and that you should have been so mistaken. It's amazing. I am sure, but for believing that you entirely approved and meant to encourage me in my attachment, I should have considered it at first too great a presumption, almost to dare to think of him. At first, if you had told me that more wonderful things had happened, that there had been matches of greater disparity, those were your very words, I should not have dared to give way to. I should have not thought it possible. But if you, who had always been acquainted with him... Harriet, cried Emma, collecting herself resolutely, let us understand each other now without the possibility of further mistake. Are you speaking of Mr. Knightley? To be sure I am. I never could have an idea of anybody else, and so I thought you knew. When we talked about him, it was as clear as possible.
Yes, not quite as clear as possible.
Not quite, returned Emma with forced calmness, for all that you then said appeared to me to relate to a different person. I could almost assert that you had named Mr. Frank Churchill. I am sure the service Mr. Frank Churchill had rendered you in protecting you from the travelers was spoken of. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how you do forget. My dear Harriet, I perfectly remember the substance of what I said on the occasion. I told you that I did not wonder at your attachment, that considering the service he had rendered you, it was extremely natural. And you agreed to it, expressing yourself very warmly as to your sense of that service, and mentioning even what your sensations had been in seeing him come forward to your rescue. The impression of it is strong on my memory. Oh, dear, cried Harriet, now I recollect what you mean. But I was thinking of something very different at the time. It was not the tramps. It was not Mr. Frank Churchill that I meant. No, with some elevation. I was thinking of a much more precious circumstance, of Mr. Knightley's coming and asking me to dance when Mr. Elton would not stand up with me, when there was no other partner in the room. That was the kind action. That was the noble benevolence and generosity. That was the service which made me begin to feel how superior he was to every other being on earth. Good God, cried Emma, this has been a most unfortunate, a most deplorable mistake. What is to be done? You would not have encouraged me then? if you had understood me. At least, however, I cannot be worse off than I should have been if the other had been the person. Now it is possible. She paused a few moments. Emma could not speak. I do not wonder, Miss Woodhouse, she resumed, that you should feel a great difference between the two as to me or as to anybody. You must think one 500 million times more above me than the other. But I hope, Miss Woodhouse, that supposing, that is, strange as it may appear, but you know they were your own words, that more wonderful things had happened, matches of greater disparity had taken place than between Mr. Frank Churchill and me, and therefore it seems as if such a thing even as this may have occurred before. And if I should be so fortunate beyond expression as to, if Mr. Knightley should really, if he does not mind the disparity, I hope, dear Miss Woodhouse, you will not set yourself against it and try and put difficulties in the way. But you are too good for that, I am sure. Harriet was standing at one of the windows. Emma turned round to look at her in consternation and hastily said, Have you any idea of Mr. Knightley's returning your affection? Yes, replied Harriet modestly, but not fearfully. I must say that I have. Emma's eyes were instantly withdrawn, and she sat silently meditating in a fixed attitude for a few minutes. A few minutes were sufficient for making her acquainted with her own heart. A mind like hers, once opening to suspicion, made rapid progress. She touched, she admitted, she acknowledged the whole truth.
Oh.
The rice cooker.
Yes.
I said it going before the reading so I could eat dinner.
Will
when
it
it was
stop
done.
on its own?
Yes.
Good.
I couldn't remember for a minute. Oh, sorry, that was a very intense moment to be interrupted by a rice cooker.
Yes.
She touched, she admitted, she acknowledged the whole truth. Why was it so much worse that Harriet should be in love with Mr. Knightley than with Frank Churchill? Why was the evil so dreadfully increased by Harriet's having some hope of a return? Oh, tell Bruno I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
He apparently did not like the rice cooker noise. Found it very upsetting.
Is he barking at it?
Bruno is my brother's Pomeranian. He's a bit high-strung. I'm very sorry. Give him a kiss for me. Oh, why was the evil so dreadfully increased by Harriet's having some hope of a return? It darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself. Her own conduct, as well as her own heart, was before her in the same few minutes. She saw it all with a clearness which had never blessed her before. How improperly had she acted by Harriet! How inconsiderate, how indelicate, how irrational, how unfeeling had been her conduct! What blindness, what madness had led her on! It struck her with dreadful force, and she was ready to give it every bad name in the world. Some portion of respect for herself, however, in spite of these demerits, some concern for her own appearance, and a strong sense of justice by Harriet, there would be no need of compassion to the girl who believed herself loved by Mr. Knightley. But justice required that she should not be made unhappy by any coldness now, gave Emma the resolution to sit and endure further with calmness, with even apparent kindness. For her own advantage, indeed, it was fit that the utmost extent of Harriet's hopes should be inquired into, and Harriet had done nothing to forfeit the regard and interest which had been so voluntarily formed and maintained, or to deserve to be slighted by the person whose counsels had never led her right. Rousing from reflection, therefore, and subduing her emotion, she turned to Harriet again, and in a more inviting accent renewed the conversation. For as to the subject which had first introduced it, the wonderful story of Jane Fairfax, that was quite sunk and lost, neither of them thought but of Mr. Knightley and themselves. Harriet, who had been standing in no unhappy reverie, was yet very glad to be called from it by the now encouraging manner of such a judge and such a friend as Miss Woodhouse, and only wanted invitation to give the history of her hopes with great though trembling delight. Emma's tremblings, as she asked, as she listened, were better concealed than Harriet's, but they were not less. Her voice was not unsteady, but her mind was in all the perturbation that such a development of self, such a burst of threatening evil, such a confusion of sudden and perplexing emotions must create. She listened with much inward suffering, but with great outward patience to Harriet's detail. Methodical, or well arranged, or very well delivered, it could not be expected to be, but it contained, when separated from all the feebleness and tautology of the narration, a substance to sink her spirit, especially with the corroborating circumstances which her own memory brought in favor of Mr. Knightley's most improved opinion of Harriet. Excuse me.
I still like disturbers of her brain
Yes.
as a phrase. It's my favorite.
Harriet had been conscious of a difference in his behavior ever since these two decisive dances. Emma knew that he had, on that occasion, found her much superior to his expectation. From that evening, or at least from the time of Miss Woodhouse's engaging her to think of him, Harriet had begun to be sensible of his talking to her much more than he had used to do, and of his having, indeed, quite a different manner towards her, a manner of kindness and sweetness. Latterly, she had been more and more aware of it. When they had been all talking together, he had so often come and walked by her and talked so very delightfully. He seemed to want to be acquainted with her. Emma knew it to have been very much the case. She had often observed the change to almost the same extent. Harriet repeated expressions of approbation and praise from him, and Emma felt them to be the closest agreement with what she had known of his opinion of Harriet. He praised her for being without art or affectation, for having simple, honest, generous feelings. She knew that he saw such recommendations in Harriet. He had dwelt on them to her more than once. Much that lived in Harriet's memory, many little particulars of the notice she had received from him, a look, a speech, a removal from one chair to another, a compliment implied, a preference inferred, had been unnoticed because unsuspected by Emma. Circumstances that might swell to half an hour's relation and contained multiplied proofs to her who had seen them had passed undiscerned by her who now heard them. But the two latest occurrences to be mentioned, the two of strongest promise to Harriet, were not without some degree of witness from Emma herself. The first was his walking with her, apart from the others, in the lime walk at Donwell, where they had been walking some time before Emma came, and he had taken pains, as she was convinced, to draw her from the rest to himself. And at first he had talked to her in a more particular way than he had ever done before, in a very particular way indeed. Harriet could not recall it without a blush. He seemed to be almost asking her whether her affections were engaged. Oh, could you get the blinds?
Oh.
We have arrived at sunset o'clock.
The witching hour.
Oh, there we go. Harriet could not recall it without a blush. He seemed to be almost asking her whether her affections were engaged. But as soon as she, Miss Woodhouse, appeared likely to join them, he changed the subject and began talking about farming. The second was his having sat talking with her nearly half an hour before Emma came back from her visit, the very last morning of his being at Hartfield. Though when he first came in, he had said that he could not stay 5 minutes, and his having told her during their conversation that though he must go to London, it was very much against his inclination that he left home at all, which was much more, as Emma felt, than he had acknowledged to her. The superior degree of confidence towards Harriet which this one article marked gave her severe pain. On the subject of the first of the two circumstances, she did, after a little reflection, venture the following question. Is it not possible that when inquiring, as you thought, into the state of your affections, he might be alluding to Mr. Martin? He might have Mr. Martin's interest in view? But Harriet rejected the suspicion with spirit. Mr. Martin? No, indeed. There was not a hint of Mr. Martin. I hope I know better now than to care for Mr. Martin or be suspected of it.
Yes, indeed.
You did your job very well, Emma.
Yes.
When Harriet had closed her evidence, she appealed to her dear Miss Woodhouse to say whether she had not good ground for hope. I never should have presumed to think of it at first, said she, but for you.
Oh, she's really
driving it home.
If I believed that Harriet could be spiteful, like she's really driving it in.
Well, no, that's the thing is that I do think that Emma's comments about, well, we shall say no more about it, but there have been matches. Stranger things have happened. There have been weirder pairings. I'm just saying. But we shall not talk about it because she was trying to encourage Emma in being interested in Frank Churchill.
Yeah.
Even though she was like, I won't get involved. And my idea of not getting involved is being like winky about it.
Right.
We won't mention his name, but
yeah.
Stranger things have happened. Wink, wink. Like that's Emma's idea of not taking action.
Right.
So
I mean, I'm not saying Emma doesn't deserve to be called out, but like
I think
the way Harriet's talking, it almost.
I think it's just that she's so confused. She's like, you gave me permission to do it, and I look to you for everything, and now I feel like you're telling me not to, and I'm so confused. Please tell me what to do.
Yeah, that's true.
I believe that more of Harriet being so confused and still wanting Emma's guidance than for her to be spiteful.
Oh, yeah, no.
I never should have presumed to think of it at first, said she, but for you. You told me to observe him carefully and let his behavior be the rule of mine. And so I have. But now I seem to feel that I may deserve him, and that if he does choose me, it will not be anything so very wonderful. The bitter feelings occasioned by this speech, the many bitter feelings which made the utmost exertion necessary on Emma's side to enable her to say in reply, Harriet, I will only venture to declare that Mr. Knightley is the last man in the world who would intentionally give any woman the idea of his feeling for her more than he really does. Harriet seemed ready to worship her friend for a sentence so satisfactory, but Emma was only saved from raptures and fondness, which at that moment would have been dreadful penance, by the sound of her father's footsteps. He was coming through the hall. Harriet was too much agitated to encounter him. She should compose herself. Mr. Woodhouse would be alarmed. She had better go. With most ready encouragement from her friend, therefore, she passed off through another door, and the moment she was gone, this was the spontaneous burst of Emma's feelings. Oh, God, that I had never seen her.
Yes, that's the problem.
Well, honestly, I think she means like, oh, I wish I'd never met her, but more, I wish she had never met me.
Yeah, that is fair.
More fitting.
That is fair.
The rest of the day, the following night, were hardly enough for her thoughts. She was bewildered amidst the confusion of all that had rushed on her within the last few hours. Every moment had brought a fresh surprise, and every surprise must be a matter of humiliation to her. How to understand it all? How to understand the deception she had been thus practicing on herself and living under? The blunders, the blindness of her own head and heart. She sat still. She walked about. She tried her own room. She tried the shrubbery. In every place, every posture, she perceived that she had acted most weakly, that she had been imposed on by others in a most mortifying degree, that she had been imposing on herself in a degree yet more mortifying, that she was wretched and should probably find this day but the beginning of wretchedness. To thoroughly understand her own heart was the first endeavor. To that point went every leisure moment which her father's claims on her allowed, and every moment of involuntary absence of mind. How long had Mr. Knightley been so dear to her, as every feeling declared him now to be? When had his such influence begun? When had he succeeded to that place in her affection which Frank Churchill had once for a short period occupied? She looked back. She compared the two, compared them as they had always stood in her estimation, from the time of the latter's becoming known to her, and as they must at any time have been compared by her, had it by any blessed felicity occurred to her to institute the comparison. She saw there never had been a time when she did not consider Mr. Knightley as infinitely the superior, or when his regard for her had been infinitely the most dear. She saw that in persuading herself, in fancying, in acting to the contrary, she had been entirely under a delusion, totally ignorant of her own heart, and in short, that she had never really cared for Frank Churchill at all. Well, that's no real surprise. I think I would have a hard time imagining anybody reading this book wouldn't see that her interest in Frank Churchill was entirely her going through the motions of what she thought was expected of her, both by society because of their relative positions in Highbury, as well as society in general, and also Mr. and Mrs. Weston's hints on the subject.
Yeah.
I think that was rather obvious.
Yes. Very true.
Which I actually don't think they really drove home in the new movie. Like, they did not spend as much time as I think they should have on her feelings towards Frank Churchill. I remember like wondering in the movie, I'm like, is she supposed to like Frank Churchill, at least at one point, right? But it was just, it's entirely conveyed through her behavior towards him.
Right.
And she never says anything to Harriet or to anyone else on the subject, which is also true of the book, but you get her inner monologue in the book.
Right,
so.
yeah. Much as with Jane Austen's other work.
Yes. This was the conclusion of the first series of reflection. This was the knowledge of herself on the first question of inquiry which she reached, and without being long in reaching it. She was most sorrowfully indignant, ashamed of every sensation but the one revealed to her, her affection for Mr. Knightley. Every other part of her mind was disgusting. With insufferable vanity had she believed herself in the secret of everybody's feelings. With unpardonable arrogance proposed to arrange everybody's destiny. She was proved to have been universally mistaken, and she had not quite done nothing, for she had done mischief. She had brought evil on Harriet, on herself, and, she too much feared, on Mr. Knightley. Were this most unequal of all connections to take place, on her must rest all the approach of having given it a beginning, for his attachment she must believe to be produced only by a consciousness of Harriet's, and even were this not the case, he would never have known Harriet at all but for her folly. Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. No, I almost said Mr. Knightley and Frank Churchill. Whoa, I bet that fanfic exists.
Oh, if you can think of it, it exists.
Well, also, the enemies to lovers is such a classic trope of fanfic.
Oh, yeah. The amount of, like, Harry Draco fanfic out there is,
Yep, it's a thing.
It is.
It was a union to distance every wonder of the kind. The attachment of Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax became commonplace, threadbare, stale in the comparison, exciting no surprise, presenting no disparity, affording nothing to be said or thought. Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. Such an elevation on her side, such a debasement on his. All right, rein it in, Emma.
Yeah, she's definitely feeling very...
She has not learned she has learned the lesson about she's not good at reading other people. She has still not learned the lesson about being classist.
Yeah, she's much like, she's still very Mr. Darcy at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, she has not achieved
the way
elevation on that subject yet.
Yeah, like the way that he congratulated himself on saving Bingley from marrying Jane. Like, this is the kind of thing that he's talking about. Like, he genuinely thought that he was saving his friend from
something horrible.
And this is the same thing that she's like, he never would have done this except for me. And obviously he has no...
and she goes on, too.
He has no personal feelings.
Yeah. Such a debasement on his. It was horrible to Emma to think how it must sink him in the general opinion, to foresee the smiles, the sneers, the merriment it would prompt at his expense, the mortification and disdain of his brother, the thousand inconveniences to himself. Could it be? No, it was impossible. And yet it was far, very far from impossible. Was it a new circumstance for a man of first-rate abilities to be captivated by very inferior powers? Was it new for one, perhaps too busy to seek, to be the prize of a girl who would seek him? Was it new for anything in this world to be unequal, inconsistent, incongruous, or for chance or circumstance as second causes to direct the human fate? Oh, had she never brought Harriet forward, had she left her where she ought, where he had told her she ought, had he not, with a folly which no tongue could express, prevent her marrying the unexceptionable young man who would have made her happy and respectable in the line of life to which she ought to belong, all would have been safe. None of this dreadful sequel would have been. Okay, she at least begins to understand that Robert Martin would have been good for Harriet, but only in the sense that she has now sunk her opinion of Harriet. She thought higher of Harriet before and wanted Harriet to rise in society until she tried to rise too far and take something away from Emma herself. Yes. That's the only time she starts to go, oh, it's not that Robert Martin has risen in her estimation, it's that Harriet has sunk. Yes. Which is pretty shitty.
It was way harsh, Ty.
How Harriet could ever had the presumption to raise her thoughts to Mr. Knightley. How could she dare to fancy herself the chosen of such a man, till actually assured of it? But Harriet was less humble, had fewer scruples than formerly. Her inferiority, whether of mind or situation, seemed little felt. She had seemed more sensible of Mr. Elton's being to stoop in marrying her than she now seemed of Mr. Knightley's. And it's entirely your fault, Emma. This is all your fault.
Yep.
Alas, was not that her doing too? She begins to understand. Who had been at pains to give Harriet notions of self-consequence but herself? Who but herself had taught her that she was to elevate herself if possible, and that her claims were great to a high worldly establishment? If Harriet, from being humble, were grown vain, it was her doing too.
Well, that's
ding, ding, ding. Because Harriet kind of leapt right over just having more self-respect to being vain.
Yeah.
Like Emma just they skipped right over her just like being less humble to just straight up being vain.
Because that's exactly how Emma was and kind of still is.
Mm-hmm. All right. Oh, shoot. We're at 40 minutes. Let me see if the next chapter... the next chapter is a little on the long side. Not too bad. We're just going to do it and try not to talk too much, okay?
Okay.
All right. Chapter 48. Sorry. It's like 5, 6, 7, 8. Chapter 48. Till now that she was threatened with its loss, Emma had never known how much of her happiness depended on being first with Mr. Knightley, first in interest and affection. Satisfied that it was so, and feeling it her due, she had enjoyed it without reflection, and now in the dread of being supplanted, found how inexpressibly important it had been. Long, very long, she felt she had been first. For having no female connections of his own, there had been only Isabella whose claims could be compared with hers, and he had always known exactly how far he loved and esteemed Isabella. She had herself been first with him for many years past. She had not deserved it. She had often been negligent or perverse, slighting his advice, or even willfully opposing him, insensible of half his merits, and quarreling with him because he would not acknowledge her false and insolent estimate of her own. But still, from family attachment and habit, and thorough excellence of mind, he had loved her, and watched over her from a girl, with an endeavor to improve her, and an anxiety for her doing right, which no other creature had at all shared. In spite of all her faults, she knew she was dear to him. Might she not say very dear? When the suggestions of hope, however, which must follow here, presented themselves, she could not presume to indulge them. Harriet Smith might think herself not unworthy of being peculiarly, exclusively, passionately loved by Mr. Knightley. She could not. She could not flatter herself with any idea of blindness in his attachment to her. She had received a very recent proof of its impartiality. How shocked had he been by her behavior to Miss Bates? How directly, how strongly had he expressed himself to her on the subject? Not too strongly for the offense, but far, far too strongly to issue from any feeling softer than upright justice and clear-sighted goodwill. She had no hope, nothing to deserve the name of hope, that he could not have that sort of affection for herself which was now in question. But there was a hope, at times a slight one, at times much stronger, that Harriet might have deceived herself and be overrating his regard for her. Wish it she must, for his sake, be the consequence nothing to herself, but his remaining single all his life. Could she be secure of that, indeed, of his never marrying at all? She believed she should be perfectly satisfied. Let him but continue to the same Mr. Knightley to her and her father, the same Mr. Knightley to all the world. Let Donwell and Harriet lose none of their precious intercourse of friendship and confidence, and her peace would be fully secured. Marriage, in fact, would not do for her. It would be incompatible with what she owed to her father, and with what she felt for him. Nothing should separate her from her father. She would not marry, even if she were asked by Mr. Knightley. It must be her ardent wish that Harriet might be disappointed, and she hoped that when able to see them together again, she might at least be able to ascertain what the chances for it were. She should see them henceforward with the closest observance, and wretchedly as she had hitherto misunderstood even those she was watching, she did not know how to admit that she could be blinded here. He was expected back every day. The power of observation would be soon given. Frightfully soon it appeared when her thoughts were in one course. In the meanwhile, she resolved against seeing Harriet. It would do neither of them good. It would do the subject no good to be talking of it further. She was resolved not to be convinced as long as she could doubt, and yet had no authority for opposing Harriet's confidence. To talk would be only to irritate. She wrote to her, therefore, kindly but decisively, to beg that she would not at present come to Hartfield, acknowledging it to be her conviction that all further confidential discussion of one topic had better be avoided, and hoping that if a few days were allowed to pass before they met again, except in the company of others, she objected only to a tete-a-tete, they might be able to act as if they had forgotten the conversation of yesterday. Harriet submitted and approved, and was grateful. This point was just arranged when a visitor arrived to tear Emma's thoughts a little from one subject which had engrossed them, sleeping or waking, the last 24 hours. Mrs. Weston, who had been calling on her daughter-in-law elect, and took Hartfield in her way home, almost as much in duty to Emma as in pleasure to herself, to relate all the particulars of so interesting an interview. Mr. Weston had accompanied her to Mrs. Bates, and gone through his share of this essential attention most handsomely, but she, having then induced Miss Fairfax to join her in an airing, was now returned with much more to say, and much more to say with satisfaction, than half an hour spent in Mrs. Bates's parlour, with the encumbrance of awkward feelings, could have afforded. A little curiosity Emma had, and she made the most of it while her friend related. Mrs. Weston had set off to pay the visit in a good deal of agitation herself, and in the first place had wished not to go at all at present, to be allowed merely to write to Miss Fairfax instead, and to defer this ceremonious call till a little time had passed, and Mr. Churchill could be reconciled to the engagements becoming known, as considering everything, she thought such a visit could not be paid without leading to reports. But Mr. Weston had thought differently. He was extremely anxious to show his approbation to Miss Fairfax and her family. It did not conceive that any suspicion could be excited by it, or if it were, that it would be of any consequence, for such things, he observed, always got about. They get about. I wonder how. They get about because you tell everybody, Mr. Weston.
Seriously.
Silly man. Emma smiled and felt that Mr. Weston had very good reason for saying so. They had gone, in short, and very great had been the evident distress and confusion of the lady. She had hardly been able to speak a word, and every look and action had shown how deeply she was suffering from consciousness. The quiet, heartfelt satisfaction of the old lady, and the rapturous delight of her daughter, who proved even too joyous to talk as usual, had been a gratifying and almost an affecting scene. They were both so truly respectable in their happiness, so disinterested in every sensation, thought so much of Jane, so much of everybody, and so little of themselves, that every kindly feeling was at work for them. Miss Fairfax's recent illness had offered a fair plea for Mrs. Weston to invite her to an airing. She had drawn back and declined at first, but on being pressed had yielded. And in the course of their drive, Mrs. Weston had, by gentle encouragement, overcome so much of her embarrassment as to bring her to converse on the important subject. Apologies for her seemingly ungracious silence in their first reception, and the warmest expressions of the regard she was always feeling towards herself and Mr. Weston, must necessarily open the cause. But when these effusions were put by, they had talked a good deal of the present and of the future state of the engagement. Mrs. Weston was convinced that such conversation must be the greatest relief to her companion, pent up within her own mind as everything had so long been, and was very much pleased with all that she had said on the subject. On the misery of what she had suffered during the concealment of so many months, continued Mrs. Weston, she was energetic. This was one of her expressions. I will not say that since I entered into the engagement, I have not had some happy moments, but I can say that I have never known the blessing of one tranquil hour. And the quivering lip, Emma, which uttered it, was an attestation that I felt at my heart. Poor girl, said Emma. She thinks herself wrong, then, for having consented to a private engagement? Wrong? No one, I believe, can blame her more than she is disposed to blame herself. The consequence, said she, had been a state of perpetual suffering to me, and so it ought. But after all the punishment that misconduct can bring, it is still not less misconduct. Pain is no expiation. I can never be blameless. I have been acting contrary to all my sense of right, and the fortunate turn that everything has taken, and the kindness I am now receiving, is what my conscience tells me ought not to be. Do not imagine, madam, she continued, that I was taught wrong. Do not let any reflection fall upon the principles or the care of the friends who brought me up. The error has been all my own, and I do assure you that, with all the excuse that present circumstances may appear to give, I shall yet dread making the story known to Colonel Campbell. Poor girl, said Emma again. She loves him, then, excessively, I suppose. It must have been from attachment only. She could be led to form the engagement. Her affection must have overpowered her judgment. Yes, I have no doubt of her being extremely attached to him. Such a kind of like understatement. To refer to being in love with someone as being attached to them and forming an attachment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting expression. It took me a while to figure out what exactly they meant by that.
Yeah. I am afraid, returned Emma, sighing, that I must often have contributed to making her unhappy. On your side, my love, it was very innocently done. But she probably had something of that in her thoughts when alluding to the misunderstanding which she had given us hints of before. One natural consequence of the evil she had involved herself in, she said, was that of making her unreasonable. The consciousness of having done amiss had exposed her to 1,000 inquietudes, and made her captious and irritable to a degree that had been hard for him to bear. I did not make the allowances, said she, which I ought to have done for his temper and spirits, his delightful spirits, and that gaiety, that playfulness of disposition, which under any other circumstances would, I am sure, have been as constantly bewitching to me as they were at first. She then began to speak of you, and of the great kindness you had shown her during her illness, and with a blush, which showed me how it was all connected, desired me, whenever I had an opportunity, to thank you. I could not thank you too much, for every wish and every endeavour to do her good. She was sensible that you had never received any proper acknowledgment from herself. If I did not know her to be happy now, said Emma, seriously, which, in spite of every little drawback from her scrupulous conscience, she must be, I could not bear these thanks. For, oh, Mrs. Weston, if there were an account drawn up of the evil and the good I have done Miss Fairfax, well, checking herself and trying to be more lively, this is all to be forgotten. You are very kind to bring me these interesting particulars. They show her to the greatest advantage. I am sure she is very good. I am sure she will be very happy. It is fit that the fortune should be on his side, for I think the merit will be all on hers. Mm-hmm. Such a conclusion could not pass unanswered by Mrs. Weston. She thought well of Frank in almost every respect, and what was more, she loved him very much, and her defence was therefore earnest. She talked with a great deal of reason, and at least equal affection, but she had too much to urge for Emma's attention. It was soon gone to Brunswick Square or to Donwell. She forgot to attempt to listen, and when Mrs. Weston ended with, "We had not yet had the letter we are so anxious for, you know, but I hope it will soon come," she was obliged to pause before she answered, and at last obliged to answer at random, before she could at all recollect what letter it was which they were so anxious for. "Are you well, my Emma?" was Mrs. Weston's parting question. "Oh, perfectly. I am always well, you know. Be sure to give me intelligence of the letter as soon as possible." Mrs. Weston's communications furnished Emma with more food for unpleasant reflection, by increasing her esteem and compassion, and her sense of past injustice towards Miss Fairfax. She bitterly regretted not having sought a closer acquaintance with her, and blushed for the envious feelings which had certainly been, in some measures, the cause. Had she allowed Mr. Knightley's known wishes in paying that attention to Miss Fairfax, which was every way her due, had she tried to know her better, had she done her part towards intimacy, had she endeavoured to find a friend there instead of in Harriet Smith, she must, in all probability, have been spared from every pain which pressed on her now. That is actually a pretty good point. Esty was pointing out to me on another day that it seemed weird that everyone made a big deal about how Emma did not try to be friends with Jane, but she questioned whether Jane had ever tried to be friends with Emma. And I really think it is the question of their position in society. That it was Emma's job to make those friendly overtures. Just as Harriet, even though Harriet arguably might be a little bit below Jane. Harriet...
Certainly, I think.
Well, I don't know.
Well, that's true. I don't know for sure. But, I mean, it sounds
hard to say. A little bit, but maybe not a lot. But Jane, at least Harriet would never have gone, oh, Miss Woodhouse, can we hang out? Can I come to your house? I think it really was Emma's job to start that friendship.
Yes.
And Jane being perhaps only below Emma in society of Highbury, at least, and then being about the same age, it was maybe odd. Everyone would notice that Emma didn't try to be friends with her.
Yeah.
I think that's what they're trying to say in this part.
Yeah, that makes sense. And good job, Esty.
Yeah.
Well spotted. Well spotted.
All right, where was I? Yes. It had been spared from every pain which pressed on her now. I hate to say that she shouldn't be friends with Harriet, because Harriet is still like a nice person, but like...
Well, and
she wasn't a very good friend to Harriet.
No. She's not. She hasn't been a good friend to Harriet.
Yeah,
she has,
and thinking herself so much higher than Harriet, and so much her
motivation was not good.
Yeah, I don't think she would have tried to meddle quite as much with Jane Fairfax as she did with Harriet.
Probably not.
Although she still probably would have meddled.
I don't know about the Fairfaxes. As Bates are obviously very poor.
Yeah.
But I mean, Harriet is.
But they're still well regarded in the community.
Yeah, Harriet is, as Mr. Knightley says, the daughter of who knows.
Yes.
I mean,
this is very true.
At that time, that
made a difference.
Yeah.
Anyway, birth, abilities, and education had been equally marking one as an associate for her, to be received with gratitude, and the other, what was she? Supposing even that they had never become intimate friends, that she had never been admitted into Miss Fairfax's confidence on this important matter, which was most probable, still, in knowing her as she ought, and as she might, she must have been prevented from the abominable suspicions of an improper attachment to Mr. Dixon, which she had not only so foolishly fashioned and harbored herself, but had so unpardonably imparted, an idea which she greatly feared had been made a subject of material distress to the delicacy of Jane's feelings by the levity or carelessness of Frank Churchill's. Of all the sources of evil surrounding the former since her coming to Highbury, she was persuaded that she must herself have been the worst. She must have been a perpetual enemy. They never could have been all three together without her having stabbed Jane Fairfax's peace in 1,000 instances, and on Box Hill perhaps it had been the agony of a mind that could bear no more. The evening of this day was very long and melancholy at Hartfield. The weather added what it could of gloom. The weather did its level best. A cold, stormy rain set in, and nothing of July appeared but in the trees and shrubs, which the wind was despoiling, and the length of the day, which only made such cruel sights the longer visible. Sounds like Seattle.
Yeah, it's like, that checks out.
I have heard people often say that England is a lot. The British Isles in general are very much like the Pacific Northwest.
Very similar climate.
The weather affected Mr. Woodhouse, and he could only be kept tolerably comfortable by almost ceaseless attention on his daughter's side, and by exertions that had never cost her half so much before. It reminded her of their first forlorn tete-a-tete on the evening of Mrs. Weston's wedding day, but Mr. Knightley had walked in then, soon after tea, and dissipated every melancholy fancy. Alas, such delightful proofs of Hartfield's attraction as those sort of visits conveyed might shortly be over. The picture which she had then drawn of the privations of the approaching winter had proved erroneous. No friends had deserted them, no pleasures had been lost. But her present forebodings she feared would experience no similar contradiction. The prospect before her now was threatening to a degree that could not be entirely dispelled, that might not be even partially brightened. If all took place that might take place among the circle of her friends, Hartfield must be comparatively deserted, and she left to cheer her father with the spirits only of ruined happiness. The child to be born at Randalls must be a tie there even dearer than herself, and Mrs. Weston's heart and time would be occupied by it. They should lose her, and probably in great measure her husband also. Frank Churchill would return among them no more, and Miss Fairfax, it was reasonable to suppose, would soon cease to belong to Highbury. They would be married and settled either at or near Enscombe. At that, all that were good would be withdrawn, and if to those losses the loss of Donwell were to be added, what would remain of cheerfulness or of rational society within their reach? Mr. Knightley to be no longer coming there for his evening comfort, no longer walking in at all hours, as if ever willing to change his own home for theirs. How was it to be endured? And if he were to be lost to them for Harriet's sake, if he were to be thought of hereafter as finding in Harriet's society all that he wanted, if Harriet were to be the chosen, the first, the dearest, the friend, the wife to whom he looked for all the best blessings of existence, what could be increasing Emma's wretchedness but the reflection, never far distant from her mind, that it had all been her own work? When it came to such a pitch as this, she was not able to refrain from a start or a heavy sigh, or even from walking about the room for a few seconds, or the only source whence anything like consolation or composure could be drawn was in the resolution of her own better conduct, and the hope that, however inferior in spirit and gaiety might be the following and every future winter of her life to the past, it would yet find her more rational, more acquainted with herself, and leave her less to regret when it were gone. Wow.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. I can sympathize with Emma a little bit.
Yeah.
Even though she's brought this all on herself, because this is a lot for her to be dealing with all at once. Yes. I mean, the fact that...
And she is very young.
Yeah.
I mean...
The fact that the whole thing with Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax happened at the same time as she found out about Harriet's attachment to Mr. Knightley is not her fault.
No.
So that all happening to her at once, it's like, that is a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I do kind of feel for her. That's harsh. She's got a lot to deal with, and she has to manage her father at the same time.
It is hard to realize, to be in love with someone, whether you just realized it or not.
Yeah.
And also to see the very real possibility that they don't feel the same way and might actually feel that way about someone else.
Yeah. The suddenly realizing you're in love with someone that you didn't realize, and realizing that you never appreciated them before.
Yeah.
And that you wasted your chance to let them know of your feelings and perhaps gain them in return, and also possibly encourage them to be interested in someone else.
Right.
But also, she has no friend to talk to about it.
Yeah.
She can't talk to Harriet.
Yeah.
She can't talk to Jane Fairfax because she's never been a friend to Jane Fairfax.
Right.
She can't talk to Mr. Knightley because he's involved.
Right.
She can't talk to Mrs. Weston, who is her confidant, because she would have to confess to Mrs. Weston all the horrible things that she did, because Mrs. Weston doesn't know the whole business.
Right.
She would have to tell her the whole history, as they say. Yes. And that would probably do her more evil than Mrs. Weston's advice would do her good.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's intense, y'all.
Yep.
Let's all take a moment to feel for Emma just a little bit, even though she needs this most desperately to become a better person.
Yeah.
And anyway, on that note, I shall leave you for the weekend. I will be back on Monday to start bringing us to the close of the book. We still have like 6 chapters to go, I think. So I don't know how many more sessions we'll have, but I will see you on Monday. And don't forget, tomorrow night, Saturday, I am doing another live stream concert. I'm doing it at 5. I've decided I'm just going to try 5 o'clock and see if doing earlier helps. And if it doesn't, the next time I do one, I'll try doing it later and see if that helps. Some of it just has to be a bit of trial and error. So 5 o'clock p.m. Pacific, 8 Eastern, Saturday night, this channel. There's an event already created for it. You can set yourself a little reminder and it'll tell you when it starts. So I hope I will see some of you there. Thanks for listening, and I will either see you tomorrow or on Monday. So have a good weekend either way. Yay.